Father's Day. I'm intrigued by this whole God thing, obviously. But I started reading a book that I don't remember if I ever read or not. It's by Marcus Borg, and it's called something like The God We Never Knew. And I think it's really helpful, something he does in there, when we start trying to think about how do we understand God, or whatever we call God. And he talks about and I can't recall the exact, he has terms he uses, but the traditional God was sort of this external figure. And the job of the traditional God was to keep everybody in line and make sure they didn't do anything wrong. And this came in real handy when Emperor Constantine made Christianity the religion of the empire, because people might have thought that it meant that Christianity conquered the empire, but what it really meant was that the empire conquered Christianity. And now the political forces of the day could use the church and the fact that they showed a little bit of favor to the church, tossed a little bit of benevolence its way instead of attacking it, to control people. And so religion started to say that everybody has their certain little role to fill. And this isn't just Christianity. Every religion at some point said, people have their role to fill, and it's just the way it's supposed to be. So if you're poor, well, that's just the way it's supposed to be. And of course, it was the wealthy people who were controlling what was said, and they didn't want to give up their wealth. And that doesn't sound too much different from what's going on today in all reality. And so the way that the economy worked was that everybody was essentially a farmer. Only the wealthy owned all the land. And so the way the wealthy made money was by either charging the people who didn't have land to rent their land to farm on it, or by getting slaves to farm the land they owned, and then the wealthy would get the crops and sell them or eat them or both. Or usually it was some combination of those two. And then you got to a point where you couldn't make any more money because you only had so much land, and that was a good excuse to go to war against the wealthy guy over the mountain, because maybe you could get some of his land. And here sat the church all along saying, well, if you're the poor dirt farmer, that's the way it's supposed to be. God wants it that way. And so that's one way to look at it. And I suppose it's an okay way to look at it. Works for a lot of people. Obviously I struggle with it. The other view is that instead of God being somebody or something who's kind of removed from what goes on, God becomes very involved, but not in an intervening sort of way. And the church says what we're trying to do is not cause people to comply, but to cause people to become compassionate. And it's language that you don't hear a whole lot in a whole lot of sermons in a whole lot of places. But there's actually the verse that is usually translated, be perfect as God in heaven is perfect, is, according to some translators, should be translated, be compassionate as God in heaven is compassionate. Now, of course, if you're trying to control people, it's better to say be perfect. Because we can't be perfect, and see, now I've got you, and so now I can get you to do what I want you to do in order to get you to behave and fall into line. The thing about getting to a God who's primarily concerned about compassion is that now there isn't this idea that whatever state you're in is where you're supposed to be. Rather, the idea becomes everybody's supposed to have enough. Nobody's supposed to get ahead at the advantage of somebody else, or at the expense of somebody else, rather. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with making money, or having a job, or having nice things, or a second car. But it does mean that as you do that, you also need to be concerned about other people, because we're all interconnected. So then this morning, I get these emails from Richard Rohr, who's well, they're probably not really from him, but he's a Franciscan priest who does a lot of work in meditation and contemplative prayer. In his email today, he talks about compassion, about God in me, loving God. And this is from a talk he gave at a meeting at something in Louisville, Kentucky called the Festival of Faiths, which was a bunch of different faiths coming together, the Dalai Lama and representatives of all different traditions. And Richard said at that festival, the Christian who has gone to his or her own depths, not all of us, I'm afraid, uncovers an indwelling presence, what might be experienced as an I-thou relationship. In Christian theology, this would be described as the Holy Spirit, which is precisely God as immanent within and even our deepest self. Some saints and mystics have described this presence as closer to me than I am to myself, or more to me than I am to myself, or sorry, more me than I am myself. Many of us would also describe this as the true self. It must be awakened. It's never created by our actions or behavior, but naturally indwelling, or our inner being with God. And that's this God in everyone idea. And it's what all of these readings had a piece of. When Sogyal Rinpoche wrote about Buddha nature, that's the same idea, that within us isn't something bad that needs to be beaten down or controlled or somehow corrected, and if we're just lucky, if we just do enough penance and give enough money and feel just badly enough about ourselves, maybe in the end, if we're lucky, we'll avoid eternal torture. And people wonder why people aren't just flocking in to hear that message. You know, it's kind of like buying a life insurance policy with no guarantee it's really going to pay off. You know? Just pay your premiums your whole life, and when you die, maybe your survivors will get something. And yet, when everybody believed that's how the world worked, and that's the only way they could see it, well then, yeah, they went for that. Now the problem is, can we let go of this idea that there's something wrong with me? You know, we all make mistakes. That's the way we're built. So making mistakes doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. None of us are perfect. Again, if you're seeing God as wanting us to care for one another, and God, in fact, rather than being this sort of guy out there, keeping an eye out to make sure we're caring for one another, being that part of us that naturally wants to care for one another. God as being something that we discover when we're in relationship with one another, not something that's trying to force us to where we don't want to go. It becomes really liberating, but we've got however many years old we are, minus maybe a couple of training that says exactly the opposite. And when we start stepping into this new place that says, I'm okay, there's plenty of people who are still in that place that says, no, we're all inherently screwed up, who will try and reel us back in. I live near the Hales Corners Walmart, and the Hales Corners Walmart built a new Walmart kind of behind the old Walmart in what used to be a driving range, and they left the building up and a megachurch went into the building. And I tried to get in there. I had to go there last night for something, I don't remember what, and they had already blocked off all the lanes of the parking lot for today's service by, I don't know what time, it must have been around 5 o'clock last night, shut it down. So people are still flocking to hear you're all messed up. And there's a natural thing that happens when you start to discover that maybe you're not all messed up, that you don't feel as compelled to flock in and let the guy direct you in like you're going to a concert or something, to be parked in the right aisle. So, well, and you are going to a concert in some way. It's natural to want to use that freedom, and it's not a bad thing, and it's in fact a good thing to not feel compelled to show up every Sunday. It's a good thing to have a life. There's nobody who's going to be angry if you do. In fact, if anybody cares about you, they're going to want you to have a life.
I understand.
And the idea that somehow having a life is a problem is probably one of the most abusive ideas ever generated by any religious system. Those of us, well, we all have friends, those of us who have had really close friendships know that we want what's best for our friend. And we're even willing at times to put aside what's best for us in order that our friend might get what's best for him or her. And yet we can't make that jump into seeing that anything worthy of calling God would want the same thing. None of us, except the most twisted of us, would really like to punish everybody for all eternity, and yet, for generations, we've said that that's precisely what a God would want to do. The real question is, I think, can we get to the place where we accept ourselves as we are, forgetting about anything else, anybody else's opinion of us? And in getting there, can we see that that's where we're supposed to be? And that when we're ourselves, if somebody doesn't like us, that's their problem, it's not ours. When we're ourselves and doing the best we can, that's good enough. Somebody once said, that's being perfect and getting better all the time. That's the goal of life. And if there is that bit of God within each of us, and I really believe there is, however you want to define God, that means that there's no throwaway people. That means there's people who do some really foolish things. All of us do some foolish things at one time or another. Some people seem to make a career out of it, and yet it doesn't mean they're bad people. Nobody's beyond redemption. Nobody's disposable. Nobody deserves to starve. Nobody deserves to sleep on a park bench because they don't have a home. And it doesn't matter who they are, where they're from, what religion they are, what nationality they are, or what they've done in the past. Because in a very unique way, it may just take each of us together to reflect the entirety of what God